Paris, winter of 1678. A thick fog slithered across the cobblestones of Versailles, curling like pale ghosts rising from the underworld. The wind whispered through marble corridors, carrying distant murmurs, groans of those who had never truly left the palace, even long after death. In places untouched by candlelight, a strange hunger stirred within the mind of the most powerful man in France, King Louis XIV. The Sun King, the embodiment of splendor and of an unnamed dread. Louis was 40 years old. His once glorious mane, thick, golden, coveted by portraitists, was now falling out in clumps. The gilded mirrors in his chambers no longer reflected majesty, but betrayal. In his court, age was not decayed, was danger. Only the blood of the innocent, of those untouched by sin, in body and in spirit. His forehead gleamed in the flickering light, vast and exposed. Pride and fear dueled silently in his chest. In the courtiers' eyes, a glimmer of awe had returned. It reeked faintly of rust, of hidden prayers and sealed mouths. The disappearances of orphans were no longer newsworthy. Nobles whispered, but none questioned. Those who did met accidents. One slipped and drowned in the royal bath. Another was dragged by panicked horses through the forest. Silence became a form of tribute. They dared not meet his gaze too long, as if some light flickered anew from his brow. Perhaps an illusion, but Louis believed. He believed the blood had worked, and he wanted more. Pride won. That blood, when applied warm, awakens the roots that slumber beneath your crown. Hair or not, he saw his reflection smiling again, and he believed. So deeply, he no longer distinguished between illusion and truth, but it must be willing. It must be given, not taken. And once blood is spilled, it rarely stops, especially when it flows to feed a king who refuses to grow old. A balding king was a vulnerable king, vulnerable to whispers, to ambition, to knives. The royal physicians were summoned. They offered everything: Egyptian oils, powdered sparrow bones, elixirs brewed with rosemary and desperation. A boy of 7, an orphan still clutching a wooden doll, was brought in his sleep. Blood drawn from his wrist dripped into a silver bowl of crushed herbs and strong liquor. Louis dipped his trembling fingers in the warm mixture, massaging it into his scalp like a penitent seeking salvation. Centurion, alcohol, and something more ancient coiled into his nostrils, then vanished. Nothing worked. Louis grew despondent. And in that despondence, a figure emerged from the margins of the court like mildew in a corner left too long in shadow. He was Chevalier Marquin, a physician-philosopher from the provinces. His face was gaunt, his eyes deep and black as bottomless wells. He never smiled, only curled his lips when the king asked, "Is it true that human blood could call hair back to life?" "No, not just any blood, your majesty," he replied, voice steady as a clock measuring the soul. Louis stared into the mirror. "Do it," he said, "but no one must know." That night, in a chamber deep beneath Versailles, absent from every map, an unholy ritual was performed. The next morning no hair had grown, but something had changed. From then on, Versailles no longer smelled only of roses and candle wax. Louis the Sun King walked tall again. His confidence returned. His fingers stroked his scalp with reverence. But Versailles, that great beast of marble and gold, had begun to bleed. Versailles was no longer a palace of celebration. It had become a living organism, injected each week with secret blood. Beneath domes of gold leaf and the glow of 1,000 candles, the walls thickened with oaths and unspeakable fear. From clergy to courtiers, everyone sensed something unnatural, but no one dared to name it. One man still held his gaze steady: Antoine de Brissac, chief physician of the royal court, educated in Salerno. The savior of the king during a bout of smallpox. Brissac had begun to suspect. He could not yet name what he felt, but he smelled it: not medicine, but old blood clinging to the sleeves of those who handled the king's bedding. At the center of all this, the king, once god among men, smiled. From then on, he never looked the king in the eye. He no longer needed bishops or counselors, only the alchemist priest who brought him the sacred red elixir. When fevers rose, Marquin would place a cold hand on the king's brow and whisper words in ancient Latin phrases. Even the clergy feared. He touched locks of hair darker than his youth, though all knew it was a wig made from the scalps of the innocent. He didn't care. For him it was proof. Proof that death could be tricked, that age could be erased with enough crimson tribute. Louis flew into a rage. He ordered the artist hanged the next morning. The court was stunned. Never before had a brushstroke cost a man his life. No one understood, but after each whisper, the king stood taller, and the harrow it grew again. For there was something in his eyes that suggested he had waited for this moment all along. I saw not a man, but a tapestry woven with the hair of the dead and stitched by silence. Rumors flowed through alleys. Someone buys blood in the dark. If you have children, keep them close. Beggars vanished by the cartload. Some swore they saw a black carriage packed with iron cages rolling through the southern gate of the palace before dawn. No one stopped it. No one asked. The hair grew thicker, or so he believed. Painters were instructed to capture him only from the left, where the strands looked fuller. Servants were taught to let their eyes linger where the powder was thickest. Louis stopped asking whether the treatment worked. He had already decided. A trickle of blood from the boy's wrist fell into a silver bowl. Bressic couldn't scream. Time froze around him, the weight of truth pressing upon his chest like a cathedral collapsing inward. The blood of the young was divine. 'Twas the sacred stream God had let slip through a crack in mortality. But not all believed. One night, Bressac followed the faintest trail of rust-colored stains down the western hallway. They were almost invisible, but patterned, like footsteps of someone carrying flesh. They led to a door not marked on any blueprint, behind which lay a narrow stairwell descending deep beneath Versailles where no music played. And no voice spoke, only the chill of earth and the rot of forgotten time. And there it was. A room of damp stone walls and crude wooden tables. Marcone bent over a child. Marcone looked up. His eyes, vast and lightless, betrayed no fear, only inevitability. "Now you see," he said, "beauty must be fed, and sacrifice only has meaning when no one dares to look." Bressic did not report, did not protest, turned and walked away, cursed with the knowledge of what power looks like when stripped bare of civility. Meanwhile, Marcone grew ever closer to the throne. Louis dismissed most of his advisors, but nothing lives forever on borrowed blood. The orphans of Paris were dwindling. Charities noticed strange disappearances. Louis, meanwhile, gazed into his mirror with newfound adoration. Then, on a June morning, something minor occurred. It was the first crack in the mask. A new royal portrait was unveiled. The painter, either careless or too honest, had rendered the hair at the back of the king's head noticeably thin. Marcane said nothing. He observed the king not like a servant, but like a creator, watching his statue tremble. Yet he did not stop. He did not warn. That night the king's hair began to fall again. On the third morning after the painter's execution, as the first rays of light pierced the red velvet curtains of the royal chamber, a maid named Annette dropped a porcelain water jug. Her hands trembled violently. She had seen something no servant dared speak aloud. On the king's pillow, a single dark strand of hair clumped, soaked with sweat and blood. Not another's. His own. It seeped from his scalp, where the once miraculous hair had begun to rot. In the days that followed, Louis's hair fell in thick clumps. But this was no return to mere baldness. It was decay. The skin on his head turned pale, then gray. New hair sprouted as wiry threads, coarse and twisted like animal fur, only to shrivel and fall within hours. Others swore they had seen him tearing at his scalp with blackened nails, kneeling before a hidden portrait of Saint Sebastian, weeping through broken teeth. One ancient chambermaid told of Lullaby's children's voices drifting from beneath the king's bedroom floor, accompanied by the clinking of a silver spoon stirring, slowly, rhythmically, as if preparing something sacred. The king ordered all mirrors removed, but in the eyes of his court the truth still reflected, silent and cold. Though the sun blazed outside, a sudden dusk fell over the room. When he wore it, blood from his raw scalp seeped through, staining his lace collar. He didn't remove it. "I am the sun," he whispered. "The sun needs no hair." He never sent it. That night, he was found poisoned by an invisible toxin, lips curled in silent agony. He wore the gold wig, his powdered face pale as wax, his eyes ringed in kohl so dark they resembled empty sockets. We drink to beauty, to blood, to all that keeps me, alive. As he entered, music ceased. No one dared move. Versailles froze beneath the shadow of a king, no longer a king, but a phantom draped in velvet. The only clue, a smear of blood across his desk, spelling one final phrase. His scalp, no longer human, worse than the hair, was the smell. The royal chambers began to stink not of perfume or incense, but of iron, old blood, and something else. The stench of something wholly spoiled. Orcan called it a transitional reaction. The soul, he claimed, was transforming and needed more blood. Much more. He began speaking to the statues in the gardens, asking if they still thought him beautiful. When they did not answer, he had them smashed. The mythic gardens of Versailles' pride were slowly razed by the very hand that had birthed them. But by now, the children of Paris had all but vanished. The last few were brought in from remote villages in Brittany, white-faced, hollow-eyed, as though their souls had already been wrung dry in the rattling cages of the king's hunger. Louis could no longer sleep. He dreamt of faceless children holding mirrors, mocking his reflection in eerie, sing-song voices. Dr. Bressac, the last man of reason within the court, wrote a letter nearly 30 pages to the Academy of Medicine. Whispers spread through the walls like mold. Some said Louis was no longer a man, but a thing stained by blood and fear. In a frenzy, Louis demanded a new wignod of human hair but forged from gold-threaded wire, polished to catch the light like the sun. And then, on a blistering August afternoon, during a rare court banquet in the Hall of Mirrors, Louis appeared. He raised his glass of red wine, though all believed it something else, and rasped through cracked lips, he drank. Crimson trickled from the corners of his mouth. The chandelier's brilliance seemed to flicker, and Versailles from that night forward was never truly Versailles again. The decline was not swift, but steady, relentless, like a cathedral sinking inch by inch into the marshes. After the banquet, the Sun King no longer appeared before the court by daylight. His chambers were sealed, the windows blackened, and no servants were permitted entry save one, Marcone. Rumors swirled through the marble halls like mist. Some said the king's skin had turned translucent, that one could see veins pulsing beneath like worms beneath glass. Others claimed he no longer spoke in French, but in a language no one could understand, choking syllables as if his mouth were filled with milk and ash. Then came the noises. No carriage departed. No footprints in the gardens. His rooms were stripped clean, his books missing, his vials shattered. Some claimed he had fled to Spain. Others said he had returned to the earth from which he was born. But those who cleaned his chamber found a wig woven from what they believed were infant eyelashes left, neatly folded on a silver plate. But diaries survive, half-burned, water-damaged, tucked into floorboards by trembling hands. At first, soft, some wept. Others stood still, lips sewn shut with black silk. Each held a bowl of blood, their own, his limbs convulsed, fingers snapping backward, eyes rolling until only the whites remained. Blood spilled from his ears, then silence. One long breath. Collapse. A royal funeral was held, yes, but the casket was sealed, never opened. And those who dared glance through the seams swore it was empty, or were occupied by something that breathed too slowly to be human. And if you stand long enough before the great golden gates, you might feel it too. His wig of gold wire had been replaced with a crown of thorns, real ones, freshly soaked in blood. His scalp was exposed, red, torn, barely flesh. The chandeliers flickered, mirrors cracked. And with each sip, his voice deepened. Layered no longer one voice, but many. Like a choir from beneath the ground, rising from soil, from bone. His face had grown long and angular, his teeth too many, his eyes milk-white. He wore no shoes. His royal robes were threadbare, stained with something darker than wine. Death came quicker. Hair fell sooner, weeping. Invitations were sent. Every noble who still breathed and dared answer was required to attend. And they did not, out of loyalty, but terror. For none wished to be counted absent. Her final words before vanishing into obscurity. He was not my Louis. He was something wearing his skin. Childlike sobs echoing from the stone beneath the palace. Then chanting low, rhythmical, not in prayer but in hunger. Some guards claimed they saw movement behind the tapestry walls, a boy's shadow darting just beyond candlelight. And when the tapestries were torn down, nothing. No passage, no child, just walls and more walls and silence. Madame de Maintenon, once the king's last great confidant, fled Versailles in the dead of night after witnessing what she called the Great Unmasking. Then suddenly Marcon disappeared. The man who had walked the palace like a priest of death was simply gone. And then the king called for the last ritual. He demanded a procession. One final act before God, before France. It was to be held in the Hall of Mirrors. What they witnessed has never been recorded in official archives. The paintings commissioned to commemorate the event were destroyed. At the center of the hall stood Louis. Around him, 12 children, pale as chalk, stood silently in a circle. "I have conquered death," the king whispered, "and now I ascend." And then he drank from each bowl, slowly, as the courtiers looked on, frozen in gilded horror. He began to shake. They say he died there, but no body was ever buried. No coffin was seen. Versailles entered mourning. The mirrors were covered. The children vanished. And in the following years, no king lived long upon the throne. And sometimes when the wind turns just right at dusk, those who walk the gardens alone swear they hear it still, that quiet whisper beneath the soil. The sound of a spoon stirring gently in something warm, a drop falling onto your scalp.